Jujutsu Kaisen Season 3 Episode 4 was the episode. It was the episode the production team went all out for, putting in lots and lots of effort and resources, a lot more so than usual, and the results spoke for themselves. This episode was absolutely ridiculous, especially the second half. It was one of the most visually interesting things across all of JJK, and I hope you understand how monumental a feat like that is. It looked incredible. Right from the get-go, you could tell that this was about to be special. It had that big episode feel, if that makes sense, and that's saying something because in a production like JJK, nearly every episode has a big episode feel. Like, come on, when has JJK ever looked normal? I guess the point I'm trying to make is high priority, Sakuga Festival, the big episode, whatever you want to call it. This episode was one for the history books, and as such, you guessed it, let's break down the visuals. Make sure to subscribe. This episode fried my brain to the point where I can't come up with a clever call to action, so just subscribe. The button's right there, it takes a second, go on, do it. You can also become a member of this channel. Members get at least 2 exclusive videos per month, custom badges and emojis, shoutouts and more. Just go down there and press the join button. As always, let's go over the staff list first, starting with the storyboards, which were once again handled by series director Shota Goshizono, making this the 4th consecutive episode he has solo storyboarded for this season, with many more on the way, if the leaks are to be trusted. Goshizono's unsurprisingly fantastic storyboards were processed by 3 episode directors, Risa Suzuki, Yusuke Tsunouchi, and Goshizono himself, and the overall direction was, again unsurprisingly, stellar. I'll talk about it in detail in a bit, obviously, but long story short, it was Goshizono reiterating just how good he is at non-action storyboards, just in case some of you suffer from short-term memory loss and forgot what last week's episode was like, and shutting down all talk of him not being good at action storyboards. Also, of course, his amazing storyboards were processed wonderfully by the episode directors, shout out to them as well. Over on the animation front, we had 4 chief animation directors, the 2 character designers Yusuke Yajima and Hiromi Niwa, character artist extraordinaire Sota Yamazaki, and JJK regular Takako Shimizu, 4 animation directors and 3 assistant animation directors, which is neither good nor bad in a vacuum, but considering the sheer amount of movement this episode had to offer, aka the sheer number of frames that had to be corrected, and the complexity of the shots, it's actually quite decent. More about the animation, the key animator list for this episode was absolutely stacked, industry-leading talent galore, which isn't exactly new for a project like JJK, but that doesn't make it any less insane. Mega veterans like Tadashi Hiramatsu and Shinsaku Kozuma, industry-leading names like Itsuki Tsuchigami, Hakyugo, and more, exciting new talent like Hone and Kohei Hirota, around 40-second key animators on cleanup duty because it is a Seishimo line production at the end of the day. This episode had it all. Now yes, I can't exactly call this episode perfect, my nitpicky eyes won't allow that, but this episode was really well animated. That's the headline here, not some of the jank I'll point out in a bit. Please don't let my nitpicking cloud your judgment, this episode was amazing. With all that being said, let's finally do the thing you guys clicked for. Let's go through this episode scene by scene. Unfortunately, I have to gloss over the first half of this episode a bit. Not only was the main bulk of animation muscle packed into the second half, the first half wasn't the most consistent thing in the world, let's put it that way, it had issues. First things first though, composition sense, Goshizono has an unfair amount of it. Every shot was incredibly interesting to look at even when there wasn't much happening animation-wise. I've said all of this before, but it bears repeating. His framing is always spacious and dynamic. There are layers of complexity, there's a pronounced sense of space, there are exaggerated perspectives. As per usual, Goshizono is allergic to framing things normally, and as per usual, I love that. We also had so many cool directorial ideas, introducing the piano as a diegetic audio cue, including this flashback as a part of the present scene instead of simply cutting to it, and making it look distant and blurry to show how things aren't the same anymore. That man is a genius. Speaking of flashbacks, the flashbacks throughout this entire episode or this season in general had this blurry, choppy look that I loved. It made them seem less like a different, unrelated scene and more like a hazy recollection of memories, which is the whole point. Really good stuff. Back to the scene at hand, animation-wise, there wasn't all that much going on. It was above average, but for a high-profile production like Jujutsu Kaisen, it was typical, if that makes sense. This fight was cool though. It was very stop and go with quick unorthodox cuts, but unlike most of Yuji vs Yuta, this actually worked in my opinion. The timing felt right, it conveyed the chaos of the whole thing well, plus the strategic use of close-ups and slow motion shots allowed them to save some of that animation power for later. Shortly afterwards, we got this eerily lifelike ragdolling followed by this meticulous and mostly consistent acting sequence, presumably animated by Aya Suzuki. Very subtle stiffness aside, you could feel the weight of every small action, the movement of the fingers, the hair motion, the body mechanics. It was incredibly well animated, fundamentally speaking. Also really well drawn short hair. A really cool stylized sequence drawn by Iki then brought us to the beach scene animated by Tadashi Hiramatsu, which is quite funny because he also animated a melancholic beach scene for the Chainsaw Man movie. The acting here wasn't over the top, but as you would expect from the penmanship of a veteran, the fundamentals were on point. The motion was heavy, with each action being accompanied by the perfect amount of weight distribution, plus the 3 to 4 tone liquid animation, beautiful drawings thanks to CAD Hirominiwa's corrections, top-notch backgrounds, and that gorgeous compositing shift made this scene incredibly cinematic. Oh, and also Goshizono storyboard's good, obviously. Following the beach scene, we got some cool action-adjacent shots. Lovely effects here, followed by a solid close-up and a large amount of background animation, really fun stuff. Now, with all that being said, here comes the uncomfortable part. Like I hinted at earlier, this section wasn't perfect, it had issues. I know some people on Twitter get upset at me for pointing out things they themselves don't have the eyesight to notice, but it is an animation breakdown, so deal with it, I guess. Was this walk cycle fairly inconsistent with distracting shifty lines? I'm afraid so. Was this other walk cycle fairly stiff, especially around the arms, despite the cool volumetric background work? I'm afraid so. Do Mai and Maki being dragged by Yogi melt a fair bit? I'm afraid so. Do some of these shots clearly suffer from subpar second key animation? I'm afraid so. Did they linger on this non-animated zoom for a bit too long? I'm afraid so. You get the idea. Really cool, really creative, but not perfect, which is quite on brand, to be honest. Anyway, let's now move on to part B, aka the start of this episode. Before we get to the action though, let me get this out of the way. I loved the overall aesthetic during the Maki Kukuru squad fight. The compositions, the aspect ratio usage, the creative color use, the general look and feel of the whole thing, it was insanely good. I know people who expect their anime adaptations to be strictly one-to-one, and the entire population of mainland Japan apparently hated this fight, but I personally loved it. The cool visual ideas and composition choices, the tremendous drawings, the dissonant soundtrack choices, so good, all of it, gold sticker from me. Anyway, the first minute or so of the action was animated by Itsuki Tsuchigami and it was incredible. First off, that's a lot of hand-drawn characters. Of course, not all of them are animated, moving that is, but still, drawing that many cell components is tedious work, and that's doubly true when they actually move. This shot, for example, this is obviously a throwaway character who almost certainly doesn't even have a design sheet, but through conservative yet meticulous line placement, Tsuchigami made his face and movement feel incredibly volumetric and alive, which is something he excels at. More about the action, this fight used a ton of quick cuts, but once again it worked, it flowed well, partially due to the incredible animation and partially due to Tsuchigami presumably modifying the storyboards a bit based on his own preferences. The shots had so much volume both in terms of the composition and the drawings themselves. There were layers of mob characters, both static and animated, plus the drawings and backgrounds were about as three-dimensional as you'd expect from a Goshizono Tsuchigami sequence. This wind-up looked amazing. Maki moving was actually animated while the characters in the back were a static cell layer being panned across the screen. We then got a quick overhead shot followed by a side profile, complete with these really cool blood effects with varying degrees of opacity and another overhead shot. Like I said, quick cuts. Of course, the actual movement was on point throughout, the lines and contours were masterfully placed and the drawings were incredible. Even a simple shot of Maki taking a step had fantastic foreshortening and volume control. Also loved Goshizono going full Gohans with this underground shot. Now yes, it is practically impossible to animate 50 guys moving constantly. It's a weekly TV episode, not a Ghibli movie, but Goshizono and team came up with clever ways to get around that. Be it the cell parallaxing, be it strategically placed still shots, be it going down the idiosyncratic shorthand drawings route instead of proper character models, something Shotaro Ban's sequence did a lot of. It didn't feel like the background characters were unnaturally stiff. I remember that being an issue in an episode from season 2, but not this time around. Also, of course, shorthand drawings or not, animating a rotation with multiple moving characters is an insanely difficult thing to do, and so is animating these buttery smooth body mechanics and these insanely complicated warped compositions, so props to Ban. Not the biggest fan of the non-animated zoom on these mobs, but overall really well animated sequence. Of course, we can't go over every single shot given the confines of time, but really good work. We then got a Hayato Kurosaki sequence, and the sheer density of the effects was insane. Why have one layer of gorgeous thick smoke when you can have another and another and another and another and another? Has some eye-catching liquid effects, has some 4-tone liquid animation that's like the most beautiful thing ever, has some hand-drawn debris so large scale that it almost counts as background animation, more liquid and smoke, such an insane sequence all around. It'll probably get overshadowed by the insanity that followed, which is a shame because just look at it, it's so cool. From this point on, the episode went full Yutaka Nakamura. The rest of the fight was one big, unapologetic homage/love letter to the Cube Man, and it was perfect. I was genuinely surprised by how convincing Goshizono's Nakamura impression was. The first sequence here was animated by Mok, which is obviously a pen name, it's not a real person. I'm pretty sure I know who that is, but let's not delve on that stuff. The scene started with some incredibly cool raw-looking smoke and satisfying fabric and hair animation, followed by this section, which again is extremely Nakamura built. The speedline background conveying a never-ending sense of space, these almost comical poses, the energetic fabric animation, these slow animated zoom-ins with exponential foreshortening, fantastic stuff. The background animation here was insane. The shapes were almost identical to the way modern Nakamura draws backgrounds, plus the kinetic sparks were a nice addition. Loved this exchange, fast motion buffered perfectly by the zoom into her hand. It's not all one speed, there's variation in the tempo, there's rising and falling actions, again amazing. Really cool lifelike acting here, followed by some large-scale background animation and this amazing rotation. It's very short, but the animator had to draw both characters in unorthodox poses at every perspective between the starting and finishing points. I hope I don't have to explain why that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. By the way, I loved how in the midst of all this insane movement, they literally zoomed into a still frame. I don't think it's meant to be comedic, but it cracked me up. Now yes, some of you might say that stuff like this clashes with the tone this episode was trying to convey, and there is some validity to that complaint. However, in my mind, it wasn't a sad, hate-filled massacre, rather it was a triumphant moment where Maki broke free of the metaphorical shackles around her ankles, and as such, from that point of view, I felt like the upbeat tone worked perfectly. Anyway, back to the action, this guy's ability was visualized extremely well. The force against Maki was conveyed through expanding concentric circles on the ground here, another Nakamura-built storyboarding choice followed by constant energetic fabric and hair animation. And speaking of force, this sequence was amazing. The way each muscle on her body was animated to show the sheer weight she was under, fantastic understanding of weight and anatomy, reminded me of that one shot from Ghost in the Shell. Also worth mentioning, the hair and fabric animation throughout this section was absolutely stellar. It made every action, even the simple ones, feel heavy and powerful. Also worth mentioning, this shot was incredible. Loved the strong foreshortening effect and the organic shading. Yusuke Yajima corrections if I'm not mistaken. This guy's attack was pure Nakamura goodness, with tens of individually drawn fists, complete with actual animated shadows literally descending from the sky and raining down on Maki, conveyed via a large amount of effects and debris instead of actual physical impact. Did I mention this fight was one big Yutaka Nakamura reference? It was. Overall, a very impressive sequence by Mok, which is definitely not just someone else. Was every drawing perfect? No, there were a few rough shots, most likely due to second case scattering aka poor cleanup, but all things considered, it was ridiculously good. Moving on, some incredible Sota Yamazaki corrections and a slightly inconsistent bit of acting then brought us to Maki vs Naoya, and it too was one big Yutaka Nakamura reference. We started with a quick exchange of strikes, followed by this eye close-up, and not only was the eye wonderfully drawn and animated, you could see a separately animated reflection of the action on it. This was in turn followed by another strike exchange, and neither of these two exchanges were looped. Every strike was uniquely animated, which is quite cool. Also love how the camera actually moves here. They had to draw the speedline backgrounds in a manner in which they had two opposite directions and met in the middle, allowing the camera to pan. We then got a few slow motion shots, ensuring the viewer doesn't get overwhelmed, and this sequence, which I know I'm repeating myself, but come on, it doesn't get more Yutaka Nakamura built than that, does it? The spiky effects, the literal Yutapon cubes with the appropriate timing and everything, the dynamic unidirectional background animation, the slow body movement with extremely fast-paced hair and fabric animation, even the use of moving after images and solid one-color backgrounds. Hey, I think Nakamura should get royalties for this episode. Anyway, this scene was animated by Julian Bentley, makes sense given the tremendous volume control on Maki, and he had to effectively animate 8 different characters here. I counted 7 different uniquely animated Naoyas, each drawn from a different perspective. We then got Proro sequence, which included some gorgeous debris and smoke animation, this really cool effect where they split the background into several layers and moved them up separately, and another after image based shot. I counted 4 uniquely animated characters here. This gorgeous close-up then brought us to more action because of course we weren't done. We had a ton of Nakamura build effects followed by Hone Hone sequence, which started off with this mind-blowing shot. Maki's body hair kept rotating, meaning he had to continuously animate Maki from all sorts of perspectives, and this was followed by some large-scale background animation with the camera actually moving along with the cell layers and changing angles because the shot wasn't complicated enough as is, I guess. Naoya was basically a smear throughout the section. His movement was too fast for our eyes, but again, like always, we were then presented with slower paced shots because visual buffers are important. Also, quick shout out to the literal animation timesheet that shows up for a split second. Loved the smooth camera movement here. The slow partial rotation / animated zoom in was really fun to look at. We then got some really cool shapes and effects drawn by Yuto Kajino, and these fun shots with shifting lines on the background meant to convey speed and motion. This shot was amazing. As Maki closed in towards the camera, the implied distance between her head and the rest of her body increased thanks to the foreshortening, giving it this 3-dimensional look. Also, the actual drawings were amazing with those blacked out eyes. 2 different styles of lingering smoke effects then brought us to the cinemascope section, and it wasn't a cheap gimmick this time around, it was actually used with purpose. The entire style of compositing changed the second those black bars appeared. The vibrance and saturation went down, the colors became more muted with warmer tones taking over, and the color contrast went up. Even the character drawings stood out. This entire section felt like a different scene, if that makes sense. Near the start of the sequence, we got this stylized Naoya shot, almost certainly drawn by So Miyazaki. Those thick, inky lines looked amazing, and the proportions of the face kept stretching and squashing, giving it a satisfying sense of flow. We then got these shots, which were presumably animated by Nakaya Onsen given the elongated facial structure, and they looked gorgeous. The placement of each line was purposeful, and the overall aesthetic sense was off the charts. Some cool effects followed, most likely drawn by Shinsaku Kozuma given those geometric edges and that trademark timing wherein the structure was intact in one frame and completely gone in the next. This shot was straight out of Naruto vs Pain with the Looney Tunes-like smeary body language, not exactly a surprise since this entire set piece both in the manga and the anime was a reference to that fight. The anime version that is, because Kege is a massive sakuga nerd. This shot was cool, some solid debris animation, although I'm not the biggest fan of the texturing on the animation layer. Funny because Naruto vs Pain actually didn't have those textures, but it looked weird too. I guess it's just a losing formula. This really cool shot with multi-layered reverse background parallaxing, some solid drawings and cool effects then brought us to another direct Yutaka Nakamura reference. Those high energy flickering effects on the wall followed by the cubic debris exploding out is straight out of Concrete Revolution. We then got what I think is Daniel Kim's sequence with the background effects having these alternating vertical lines which later transformed into actual smoke, this buttery smooth punching animation, and this part where everything besides Maki's mouth froze. We then returned to our regular aspect ratio and compositing and got these highly ambitious partial rotations. Like I said earlier, rotations are inherently difficult to animate, especially when the character has an unorthodox pose, and that's doubly true for slow rotations like these. Think about it, if the rotation is fast, the animator has to draw less frames, but if the rotation is slow, the number of intermediate frames between point A and point B skyrockets, making it incredibly difficult to maintain volume and line consistency. With all that in mind, the sequence wasn't the most consistent thing in the world, but it was an admirable effort. Not sure if it was Daniel Kim as well. We then got the big punch with a brand new build-up, 4 different angles and a couple of meticulously animated slow-motion shots, including this X-ray view of his skull getting crushed. I believe parts of this section were animated by Itsuki Tsuchigami, since it was his idea to begin with. Such a fantastic sequence all around, filled with insanely high-level talent. Even Hakyugo was in there somewhere, I'm not entirely sure where, perhaps some of the effects, but I'm not sure, but he was there. Insane stuff. And with that, the fight came to a close. Daniel Kim's presumed penmanship served as the immediate aftermath, which was then followed by a hefty amount of slightly stiff but ultimately solid character acting, partially animated by China, and finally by the same composition as the first shot we saw, making it a full cycle moment. Amazing stuff. And that was the episode. Again, for the millionth time, this was insane even by JJK standards. A group of incredibly talented artists working under a tremendously creative director and not horrible production conditions usually tend to make magic, and this was no different. Of course, I am looking forward to the rest of the core, but I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being the visual peak. I heard the last episode is supposed to be incredible as well, so who knows? Exciting stuff either way. And that's it. A special thanks to Nude03, Amir, the Gallus90 and Shiki-san for becoming tier 3 members, and until next time.